To our tutorial on how to modify graphs in Minitab. We've been working through a playlist on all things surrounding attribute agreement analyses, and I want to take a break here and kind of focus in on one narrow component because I don't think we've really addressed all the different ways that you can modify graphs in Minitab, but it is, I think, one of the strengths of the software and one of the reasons I most like using it. It's very easy and straightforward. So if you recall, we made in a previous how-to a bunch of time series plots of all of our assessments. You can go back and click that if you want to learn how to make a time series plot, but you can see it generated these 10 different plots here. But they're not quite in the final form that I would like to see them. And so we're going to walk through all the ways we could potentially modify a plot. Now, I had each of them created as a separate graph, not as a panel in a graph. So each of these are fully separate graphs. You can see I've already modified a few of them up at the top. So let's start here on the sample 3 graph. Okay. The first thing that happens is we just sort of intuitively click where we want. I just double clicked here on the legend. And what that does is it brings up a close-up of our plot. Now there's other ways I could do that. I'll X out of there. I could have also hit cancel. I can hit this drop down next to the graph I'm interested in and say edit graph. And that'll do the exact same thing. Now, for our purposes of this video, I want to make this extra large, although the size it does make it is perfectly fine. So you can see here. Now, first of all, the thing on the right, the legend, I feel like is a little bit confusing for our purposes. Since we only see one particular line, I have each of these samples in its own separate graph. But putting it on one graph is not really particularly helpful. I like to handle saying which is which in with the title of the graph. So all I do, I just double clicked on it there and it selected it, like an object. I clicked too much and it brought up a pop-up. Now I just hit delete. Bam, it's gone, and I have the added benefit that my graph just resized to use up the space. It doesn't just hang out there looking awkward or making you manually adjust it. Now, another thing that comes up a lot is corporate branding. So I want to jump into kind of the style of the graph before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts here. A lot of times you're going to work for a company and your graph may be part of something else that is corporately branded. And so you may want to make changes to more closely align what you're doing with that. Now, there's limits to what you can do, but Minitab is pretty flexible. So let's say you don't need to necessarily be concerned about differentiating it, or maybe you just don't like the default pattern that Minitab chose. There's symbol patterns and there are line patterns. So I click on a symbol, and I don't know if you can see, but it selected all the symbols here. So now I'm just going to double click, and these symbol attributes come up. So currently it's just automatic. But what I want to do is create a custom symbol. And let's say I don't like this triangle. I really like circles. Well, there's a variety of circles I can choose from, honestly, depending on what you want. For our demo today, and I think it's kind of the easiest read, I like the solid circle. Let's say though, actually now that I'm looking at it, I think this solid circle is too big. I like really small, kind of petite graphs. So what I want to do is go in and I can adjust the size. Instead of 0.75, let's make that just 0.5. Not too small, but a little bit smaller. Actually, that's not small enough. Let's do it again and go. We'll do 0.35. How about that? And while I'm in here, we can discuss colors. Now, we could be doing all of this at the same time, but I just want to show you the differences in the adjustments one at a time. So after I did one thing, I would hit OK. But if you have something you already want to work with, then you can come in and make those adjustments. Now, one thing that I do not believe Minitab has currently developed the ability to do, although maybe it will in the future, is let you put in a color code. What you have to do instead is just kind of select the closest match to your color. So let's say you have some corporate branding you're trying to match, and this is a good one. This is kind of close to a gray Sigma green. So I'm going to select that and hit OK. And now you can see I have very petite dots and they're very dark green. Well, I still have a purple line here. All right, because you do them separately, not at the same time. So now I just double click on the line because that looks a little bit silly. And you can see I have line options. So I'll go to custom. Now I love all their line options, but given this is a standalone graph and my dots are really, really small, I'm going to just go with a solid line and hit OK. Whoops, I forgot to do the color actually. That was silly. So I turned it into a solid line, but the color is still automatic. So now I'm going to get that matching gray Sigma green and put that there. Okay, so depending on where you are going to be showing this graph, maybe this is perfect, or maybe your dots are too small. Under further consideration, maybe I do want to make them point. All right. Oh, it made them white. Somehow that happened. I thought it was just taking a minute to load. Okay. So now they're 0.5 and they're gray Sigma green. Now what I just did here to align to your branding, you can also do to your font. One note I will make about branding that often comes up, depending on how your corporate branding works, is that sometimes a graph can suffer at the hands of a branding scheme. Now this is just one line, so it doesn't make much difference. But a way a lot of branding works is they won't just have a green and an orange. They'll have 5 shades of similar green. Now imagine you had 10 lines on a graph, or even just 3 lines on a graph. 3 different shades of similar green can be a little challenging for the eye to differentiate. So I would counsel you to first make sure your graph is optimized for readability and submit to your branding as far as you can without compromising that readability. Because if you put a graph out there that's just confusing, no amount of branding in the world is going to help the discussion. All right. So Minitab also defaults to all of these labels: time series plots of assessments, or assessments versus run order. Those are just the column headings. But let's say that that's a little bit confusing for your reader. They may be a non-technical reader, or even if they are, you just want to use what you call it in your company. So if you remember our example, what we've been doing is we've been evaluating applications. So this is a time series plot of basically the level, they would call it a level in this example, a level of a credential assigned by a reviewer. So if you wanted to make a really long title, you could you could call it a time series plot of, let's say, credential level assigned. Now you also have the option to just take out the words time series plot. I like to leave them in a little bit, just as that point of connection on what I was doing here, and to emphasize that this does follow a time order. But now, and I'm not using the word assessment, I might want to change this. And I just double clicked here. And in the text, I'm going to call it credential level assigned. Okay, now there's another thing here that it's asking me, and you can see there's a lot of more options up here, and that is I can change things like font, style, size, what have you. So I often tend to go towards the small, so we'll do that in some areas. And you can see there's not an exhaustive list of fonts, but it's not like 3 either. So if your specific corporate font isn't in here, and they usually aren't, oftentimes a branded font is really unique, but you might be able to find something similar. So let's say I wanted to just do, not papyrus, let's just go with good old Arial. I can click that, and I can apply it to all the axes. All right, so now you can see things changed to Arial. So if I click on Run Order, that should say Arial. It does say Arial. Okay, so I'm going to cancel that. I'm not going to change Run Order. If you wanted it to say something else, you'd change it exactly that way. Now I might change this samples equals 3. That might be a little confusing. I don't want people to think we have 3 samples here. I'm going to call it application 3. And if I want, I can put a little more detail on there. So I'm going to pretend that this was Grace Sigma. That was our application for a credential. So I can give that extra information there in the title. And in this instance, I will go a little bit smaller. And I see it did not change the title, so I'll change that to Arial and hit OK. All right, so these are just a few ways that you can adjust the style of your graph if you need to make it conform something different than the Minitab defaults. I often will just go with the defaults unless I get a notice that there is some sort of branding that needs to be taken into account, because the defaults are really very good at highlighting what the graph needs to show and differentiating different points of data. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about graph adjustments or any requests for future videos, just send us a message or comment below, like and subscribe to this channel, and we will be happy to work through those.